The fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I restocked the refrigerator case with energy drinks. It was 3 a.m., and I was halfway through my graveyard shift at Miguel's corner store in Queens. The familiar hum of the ancient refrigeration units and the occasional passing car were my only companions. I'd been working these night shifts for 6 months now, saving up for community college, and they were usually uneventful. Usually. I was organizing the candy aisle when the bell above the door chimed. Through the convex security mirror mounted in the corner, I saw a man in a dark jacket enter. Something about his movements seemed off, too deliberate, too measured. He lingered by the magazines longer than any normal customer would at this hour. My hand instinctively moved toward the panic button under the counter. The security cameras were rolling, but I knew from experience that their grainy footage and limited angles left plenty of blind spots throughout the store. Miguel had been meaning to upgrade the system for years, but like many things in the bodega, it remained unchanged. I watched the man's reflection in the scratched plastic mirror as he moved between aisles, never picking anything up, just watching. My attention shifted to the storage room door behind the counter. Its lock had been acting up lately, sometimes not catching properly when it closed. I'd mentioned it to Miguel twice this week. The door led to our stockroom and the back exit, my only other escape route besides the front entrance. I made a mental note of its location as I pretended to straighten items on the shelves. Through the gaps between stacked boxes of instant noodles, I could see the man was wearing latex gloves. In July. My heart rate quickened as I recalled the news report I'd seen last week about a string of bodega robberies in the area. 3 stores hit in 2 weeks, all during the graveyard shift. The last clerk who resisted was still in intensive care. I moved behind the counter, positioning myself where I could reach both the panic button and the baseball bat Miguel kept beside the register. The man finally approached, placing a single pack of gum on the counter. His gloved hands were steady, methodical. As I rang up the purchase, I noticed a second set of footsteps coming from the chip aisle behind me. They had worked this out, timed it perfectly. One to distract, one to come up from behind. Through the security mirror, I caught a glimpse of the second man emerging from the shadows, his face obscured by a dark hood. The first man's latex-covered fingers drummed on the counter as I fumbled with his change, buying precious seconds. In that moment, I remembered something else from the news report. These guys didn't just rob stores. They were methodical, cruel. They'd forced the other clerks to open the safes, then bound them with zip ties before ransacking the stores. One victim said they'd spent almost an hour terrorizing him before finally leaving him locked in the freezer. These weren't desperate addicts looking for quick cash. They were calculated predators who enjoyed the process. The sound of glass shattering behind me made me jump. The second man had knocked over a jar of salsa. Accidentally or on purpose, I couldn't tell. As I turned instinctively toward the noise, the first man vaulted over the counter with surprising agility. I saw the glint of a blade in his gloved hand. My fingers found the panic button, and I slammed it hard enough to hurt. The silent alarm would bring police, but not fast enough. The first man grabbed my arm, his latex grip cold and impersonal. "Open the safe," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Make it quick and quiet." The second man was blocking the front door now, holding something that looked like a zip-tie gun. My mind raced through options, each worse than the last. I knew the safe's combination, 52983, but its ancient mechanism took nearly 30 seconds to open once the code was entered. The men knew this too. They'd done their homework. As I knelt by the safe, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small red stain on the first man's sleeve that looked too dark to be paint. The faulty storeroom door caught my eye again. If I could just get through it, I might have a chance. The back exit led to an alley connected to the main street. But first, I'd have to get past at least one of them. My fingers trembled as I pretended to enter the safe combination, deliberately making a mistake to buy time. A crash from the alley made both men flinch. Probably just the stray cats that frequented our dumpster, but it was the distraction I needed. In one fluid motion, I grabbed the baseball bat and swung it upward, catching the first man under his chin. The impact sent vibrations through my arms as he stumbled backward, knife clattering to the floor. I dove for the storeroom door, knocking over a display of energy drinks in the process. The second man's footsteps pounded behind me as I slammed through the door, praying it would catch and slow him down. The lock's malfunction worked in my favor. The door stuck for a crucial moment before bursting open behind me. The stockroom was a maze of boxes and shelving units. I knocked over everything I could as I ran, creating obstacles behind me. My lungs burned as I sprinted toward the back exit, hearing them curse and crash through the debris. The first man was shouting something about making me regret this, his voice distorted by what I assumed was a broken jaw. I hit the back door at full speed, the cool night air striking my face as I emerged into the alley. In the distance, I could see the reflection of approaching police lights bouncing off wet brick walls. The sound of sirens was getting closer. Behind me, the door banged open again. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, not daring to look back. The police arrived just as I reached the main street, their cars screeching to a halt from both directions. The two men were caught in the alley, trapped between the building and the approaching officers. Later, I learned they were wanted for a series of increasingly violent robberies across 3 boroughs. The red stain I'd seen wasn't paint, it was blood from their previous victim. I quit the night shift the next day. Miguel understood completely and even gave me a month's severance pay. The police told me I was lucky. These men had been escalating, becoming more violent with each robbery. They found detailed notes in their car about my store's layout, my schedule, and the safe's delayed mechanism. They had been watching for weeks, learning our patterns. Sometimes I still check the security mirrors when I shop at convenience stores, and I never go out alone at night anymore. Some shifts, it turns out, aren't worth the extra $1 an hour. I was counting the minutes until closing time at my aunt's bodega in the Bronx. The summer heat had kept most customers away, and the ancient ceiling fan did little more than push the hot air around. At 7:55 p.m., I started my usual closing routine, even though we technically stayed open until 8:30. Nobody ever came in this late anyway. At least, that's what I thought until I heard the bell chime. The new thermal security cameras my aunt had installed were picking up something odd. While they showed me clearly at the counter as a red-orange figure, there was another heat signature by the door that seemed too cold, too blue. I adjusted the monitor, thinking it must be malfunctioning. That's when I noticed the temperature reading on the digital thermometer had dropped 10 degrees in the last minute. Dark clouds had gathered suddenly, bringing an unseasonable chill to the July evening. Through the window, I watched newspaper pages tumble past like urban tumbleweeds. The neon open sign started to flicker, its red glow creating strange patterns on the rain-slicked sidewalk. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The bell above the door rang again, but differently this time. A hollow, discordant sound that made my skin crawl. The door hadn't opened. I'd been working here since my aunt got sick 3 months ago, and I'd never heard it make that sound before. The security monitor showed another cold spot, this time by the cereal aisle. A box of Cheerios fell from the shelf, spilling its contents across the linoleum floor. As I walked over to clean it up, I noticed something strange about the spill pattern. The cereal wasn't scattered randomly. It formed an almost perfect circle, as if poured deliberately. The thermal camera showed the cold spot had moved to the dairy case. The glass door of the dairy case had fogged up, despite the refrigeration being set to its normal temperature. As I watched, what looked like a handprint appeared in the condensation, but it wasn't made by warming the glass. Instead, it looked like something had frozen it from the inside. I pulled out my phone to call my aunt, but there was no signal. The receipt printer suddenly whirred to life, spitting out paper covered in random characters and corrupted lines of text. I tried to turn it off, but it kept printing. Among the gibberish, I could make out what looked like dates, all of them from exactly 1 year ago. That's when I remembered what had happened at this store last summer. The framed newspaper article hanging behind the counter caught my eye, the one my aunt never talked about. Last July, a desperate man had held up the store, taking an elderly customer hostage. The situation had ended badly for everyone involved. My aunt had been so traumatized she could barely work here anymore. That's why she'd hired me to take over most shifts. A shopping basket crashed to the floor near the back corner, the same corner where it had happened. The items spread out in another perfect circle, just like the cereal. The thermal camera showed the cold spot had moved there too, and it was growing larger. The temperature in the store had dropped another 15 degrees. The store's old rotary phone started to ring. We never used it anymore, except for emergencies, and I didn't even know it was still connected. The sound was wrong, though. Instead of a normal ring, it produced a series of low, pulsing tones that made my teeth hurt. The receiver lifted off its cradle by itself, swinging gently on its coiled cord. The ancient calculator on the counter suddenly came to life, its green LED display flickering with repeating numbers. 07 21 23, over and over, the date of the incident. The thermal camera now showed cold spots all over the store, like blue holes punched in the warm air. The temperature had dropped below 50 degrees. The wall clock's second hand began to move erratically, spinning backward then forward as if time itself was breaking down. I tried the front door, but the lock had engaged itself somehow. The key didn't work. Through the window, I could see people walking past, but when I banged on the glass and screamed for help, they didn't seem to hear me. Products began to fall from the shelves, but instead of scattering, they arranged themselves in concentric circles on the floor. Cans rolled into perfect orbits around an empty center point. Bags of chips floated down like leaves. The thermal camera showed all the cold spots converging toward the back corner, forming a massive void of blue. Frost crept across the windows from the inside, cutting off my view of the street. The temperature had dropped to near freezing. The security monitor showed the cold spots merging into one massive blue shape, and in its center, I could almost make out a figure. That's when I noticed something else on the screen. The timestamp was showing last year's date. The small TV we kept behind the counter for slow days switched on by itself, showing nothing but static at first. Then, through the noise, I began to see fragments of security footage. Not from today, but from a year ago. The same corner, the same time, the same tragedy playing out in reverse. Thick frost patterns crawled up the walls of the back corner, forming intricate spirals and circles. The emergency light kicked on, bathing everything in a bloody red glow. The thermal camera showed the temperature in that corner had dropped below zero. In the center of the cold void, the figure had become clearer, an outline I recognized from the newspaper photos. Every screen in the store, the security monitors, the TV, the calculator, even my dead phone, showed the same timestamp now, 07/21/23, 8:27 p.m. The exact moment it had happened. The cold had become unbearable, and I could see my breath forming frozen crystals in the air. That's when I finally understood. This wasn't just an haunting, it was a convergence of time. They found me the next morning when my aunt came to open the store. I was huddled behind the counter, surrounded by perfectly arranged circles of products, frost still melting on the windows. The security footage showed nothing but static, and the thermal cameras had shorted out. The old rotary phone was off the hook, the calculator display was dead, and the temperature was back to a normal July morning. The police didn't believe my story, of course, but they couldn't explain the perfect circles of products, the frozen condensation patterns, or why every digital device in the store showed last year's date. My aunt didn't seem surprised, though. She just nodded and said she'd been waiting for something like this to happen. She sold the store the next week. The new owners gutted it completely, but they say strange things still happen there every July 21st, when the sun goes down and the temperature drops. The basement of Lee's Family Market had always given me the creeps. Even after working here for 3 years, I hated going down there for inventory. The narrow concrete stairs led to a maze of storage rooms that seemed to stretch further than the building above. But today was different. Today, I noticed something about the far wall that would change everything. It started with measurements. Being the practical person I am, I'd been mapping the basement to help Mr. Lee optimize our storage space. But the numbers didn't add up. The basement wall seemed to end 15 feet before it should have, considering the building's exterior dimensions. I might have ignored this if not for the strange discoloration pattern on the bricks, perfectly rectangular, about the size of a door. While searching through decades-old inventory records in the corner, I found something odd. Ledgers from the previous owner, dating back to 1985. Most entries were normal: cigarettes, beer, basic groceries. But there were other entries too, marked with strange symbols instead of product names. The amounts were massive, always paid in cash. I borrowed some tools from the ancient maintenance box Mr. Lee kept downstairs. The wall's surface was solid brick, but when I tapped it with a hammer, certain sections sounded hollow. I found myself staying late that night, long after we'd closed. I needed to organize the storage room. He seemed unusually nervous about my presence there, but didn't stop me. It took hours of careful work to create a hole big enough to shine a flashlight through. The space beyond was dark and still. The beam caught something metallic, shelving perhaps, or old equipment. The air that escaped was stale, carrying a scent I couldn't identify. I should have called the police right then. Instead, I made the hole bigger. The hidden room was long and narrow, lined with metal shelving units covered in decades of dust. Empty wooden crates were stacked against one wall, their labels long faded. But it was the floor that caught my attention. Specifically, the strange markings scratched into the concrete, like someone had been counting days. In a rusted filing cabinet, I found more records. These weren't store invoices. They were shipping manifests, each marked with the same symbols I'd seen in the old ledgers. The dates matched, 1985 through 1987. There were names too, but not of products. They were people's names, each followed by a price. Beneath the papers, I found a stack of Polaroids. The photos showed the store in the 1980s, but focused on strange details. The basement door, specific sections of shelving, the back alley. Some showed the hidden room when it was still in use. The last photo made my blood run cold. It was of another hidden door at the far end of this secret space. The second door was steel, with multiple locks that had been sealed shut by rust. It took all my strength to break through, and every instinct told me to turn back. The space beyond was smaller, more purposeful in its construction. The walls were lined with something that looked like sound insulation, now rotting away. The implications of what I found in that room keep me awake at night. Chains bolted to the wall, a rectangle of clean concrete where a mattress had once laid, scratch marks on every surface. This wasn't just a hidden storage space, it had been a prison. According to the documents, at least 17 people had been held here between 1985 and 1987. I spent the next week at the library, going through microfiche records of local newspapers from that period. The missing persons reports lined up perfectly with the dates in the manifests. Young people, mostly immigrants, who had simply vanished. The police had never connected the cases. The Bodega's previous owner had died in 1988, taking his secrets with him. In a box of old security tapes, I found recordings from the store's exterior camera. Most were too degraded to watch, but one showed a van that arrived regularly at 3 a.m., always parking in the same spot in the alley. The license plate was visible in one frame. When I ran it through an online database, I found it had belonged to a shipping company that was investigated for human trafficking in the early 1990s. No charges were ever filed. I finally called the police. They'd been working down there for weeks now, cataloging evidence, taking samples. They found things I had missed, hidden compartments in the walls containing old documents, a ledger with more names, trace evidence that confirmed their worst suspicions about what had happened in that room. The investigation expanded. They found connections to trafficking rings that had operated across the East Coast in the 1980s. The Bodega had been a waypoint, a place to hold people before moving them elsewhere. The business cards they found in the walls linked to shell companies in 3 different countries. It had been an elaborate operation, hidden in plain sight. Mr. Lee was horrified when he learned the truth. He had bought the store in 1990, long after the previous owner's death, and had never known about the hidden rooms. The wall had been professionally sealed and disguised before the sale. He gave me 3 months paid leave to deal with the trauma of my discovery, but I never went back. They're still finding new connects solving cold cases that had been abandoned decades ago. Families are finally getting answers about their missing loved ones. Sometimes I walk past the store and see the new owners renovating, stripping everything down to the bare walls, trying to erase the building's dark history. But I can't forget what I found in that basement. Proof that monsters don't hide under beds or in closets. They hide behind ordinary walls, in ordinary places, counting their profits while the rest of us count our blessings.